Well, thank you for being here to hear about the future of travel demand on such a gorgeous day when you could be outside enjoying this weather. It's always a pleasure to come back to the Berkeley campus, though I have to say it does make me feel a little old when I think about how long ago those 4 years I spent here were. A long time ago, this building didn't even exist. It's a wonderful addition to the campus. So I'm going to talk about the future of travel demand and share with you a bit about some of the work we're doing up at UC Davis, which is very much related to some of the work that Joan Walker is doing here at Berkeley, along with work that Susan Shaheen and others are doing. And I will just caveat this, that this is really, we're really in the midst of a lot of interesting work going on with respect to the future of travel demand, because there are very interesting things going on in the world with respect to the future of travel demand. So a lot of this is work in progress, but hopefully there's some enticing ideas for you today. So I think we all know where the future of travel demand in the world is headed. The statistics about the increasing motorization of transportation around the world are really startling and rather scary. We worry about all of this motorization for a whole lot of reasons, including the energy consumption associated with all of this transportation, of course the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and thus climate change, but a whole lot of other reasons as well, other forms of pollution, the resiliency of our system, congestion, equity, sprawl, safety, and so on. A lot of reasons to be concerned about motorization, and a lot of reasons to be thinking about where is the future going and what can we do about it. So, one thing we can do is reduce the impact of driving in different ways. So my colleagues at UC Davis are working a lot on things like alternative fuel vehicles, electric vehicles, and other forms of alternative fuels, infrastructure design, minimizing the impacts of the infrastructure that we provide for our automobiles. But of course, the other thing we can do is think about getting people to do something other than drive. And this is kind of fun to think about, because really we're talking about getting people to do things like they used to do. Now, a couple years ago, we were looking at the trends in how much vehicle travel there is in the US. So we use this measure of vehicle miles traveled, VMT. This is the graph of VMT per capita in the US. And you can see that for decades we had this steady, very steady increase. And then something happened in the 2000s, right about here, where people got very excited and said, maybe we have reached this point of peak driving, that people are driving as much as they possibly can, and that will help to take care of the problem, that we won't have to deal with this continued increasing trend in VMT. But of course, when you look at what's happened in the last year or so, we are seeing a bit of an uptick again in how much people are driving. So now there's some backing off on this thought that we may have reached peak driving. But in any case, it does raise lots of really interesting questions about what is the future. Have we reached something of a plateau where we'll be going up and down a little bit, or are we going to be back on this trend of steady increases in VMT per capita? So, of course, one of the big thoughts is that what happened in the 2000s had to do with the economy and the Great Recession. Yeah, that's probably a part of it. But as others have noted, there's this very interesting sort of divergence in the trend of VMT per capita and GDP per capita, where for decades you could pretty much line them up. So, this is a little bit artificial, but increasing roughly at the same sort of rate. But maybe in the last decade there is this divergence here. And I think that makes sense, that maybe our economy, as it is increasingly virtual, is less tied to physical movement, at least of people. Not talking about goods yet. So that's clearly a part of this story about what's going on with the future of travel demand, and much more to be learned about what's going on here. Others have cited a whole bunch of other kinds of trends that may be contributing here. So what's going on with income or fuel prices, traffic congestion, so on and so forth. A whole bunch of aggregate trends in society that may be influencing how much each of us is driving. But there's another way to think about this, and this is the approach I want to take today, is to dig underneath these aggregate trends and think about how we as individuals and households are making our decisions about travel, and take a look at how and why these choices are changing. So I'm going to start with a little bit of Travel Behavior 101 to kind of set up a framework, and then talk about some things going on at this more individual level rather than in an aggregate sense. So one thing that's important to note is that although our focus may be on daily travel, how much we are driving, whether we're driving or taking the bus or the train, those sorts of short-term choices, what we might think of as daily travel choices, are embedded within longer-term choices. So to understand these shorter-term choices, we've got to think also about the longer-term choices that people are making. So we travel behavior researchers talk about sort of mid-range choices about having a driver's license or not, owning a car or not. And that's going to condition our short-term choices about what we do on a daily basis. But then all of these choices are embedded in even longer-term choices about where we live, where we work, even our lifestyle sorts of choices that determine our need for and want for transportation. So to really understand these daily choices, we've got to think about this whole set of choices and how they're connected to each other. So that's the first point I want to make. Then the second piece I want to throw out here is the choice process. So here's one way we can think about how people make those kinds of choices. The first piece is what sorts of choices are available. So if we're talking about daily travel and what mode you pick, you know, you might have drive alone, shared ride, bus, rail, bike, walk, skateboard. I saw skateboarding on campus here. We have a lot of that in Davis. So what are the set of choices available to you? The second piece would be the qualities of those choices available. So the monetary cost, the travel time, we know those are really big factors that affect the choices that people make, but also things like comfort and safety come into play. And then the last piece is the value that people put on those different qualities. So how much I care about travel time versus comfort versus safety. And of course, all of this looks different for each one of us, which makes it hard for us to understand and even more so predict what people are going to do. And then to this picture, I would add a couple of further complications. The first being that the sets of choices available and the qualities of the choices available, those are all filtered by our knowledge and perception. So there is the reality of those things, and then there is our understanding and perception of those things. So that's an interesting thing to think about, because you can change the reality, but if you don't also change the knowledge and the perceptions, you might not have any impact on the choices that people make. And then the other caveat I would put here is that all of this takes place within the context of our individual needs for travel and our constraints on travel. So again, it plays out differently for every individual. Okay, so that's the framework. You put those two things together and you get a nice matrix. I love matrices. And what's interesting to think about is what's going on in each of these cells. So we can look at the short-term, mid-term, long-term choices, what choices are available to us, what are the qualities of the choices, and what value are we putting on those qualities. And if you think about it, there are important changes potentially going on in each of these different cells. Now, I don't have time to go into all of that, so I'm going to focus in particular on first what's going on with the choice set for our daily travel, and then I'll come back and talk about the value of the qualities and the interesting things going on there. Okay, so I think we all know what's going on with the choice set available to us, that we're seeing this proliferation of new modes, or at least new versions of old modes. And we're talking about this in terms of new mobility options. So examples of this include bike share systems, which are proliferating across the US at a really an astonishing rate. Interesting questions here about how they fit into the existing transportation system. Are they complements to transit or substitutes for transit or both? What about equity of access is an issue people are looking at. These micro transit services, privately provided on demand, very interesting innovation. Again, question about, is it competing with public transit, or are these services bringing new people to transit who wouldn't be getting on a public transit system anyway? Is it getting people out of their cars? And of course, all of this is evolving as we speak. So since I first prepared this talk last summer, LEAP has gone away, right? So this makes it very hard to study what impact these services are having, because they're coming and going pretty quickly at this point. Car access without ownership, different versions of this. So first we had the car sharing services, various sorts. Susan Shaheen's done some great work on what are the impacts of these services in terms of people. Are they owning fewer vehicles? Is it a supplement to the vehicles they own? Does it mean people are driving less, or is it about giving people who wouldn't otherwise be driving access to cars, so they're driving more? And again, it's probably some mix of those things, and evolving as we speak. The ride-sharing services, same sorts of questions here. My news feeds this morning were all about Uber and Lyft being a partner with transit, and helping to make transit more viable for people in terms of solving the first mile, last mile problem. Again, I think it's all still evolving, and we're not quite sure yet what the net impact is going to be in terms of how much people are driving. And then, of course, there's the automated future, where if we have fully autonomous vehicles, I think that's a game changer in a lot of ways, and remains to be seen when that's going to happen and exactly what form it's going to take. So if it ends up being individually owned cars, that has, I think, a very different implication for how much we're driving than if it is a more publicly owned, shared ride sort of system that looks a lot more like a public transit system than private vehicles. So I've sort of intentionally picked this kind of dark image because I am fearful that we're going to end up with potentially a whole lot more VMT with automation. But again, we will see. So, so choice sets, lots of changes there, which is mixing up what we're doing and leading to some interesting changes. But the other thing that's going on, I think, and this is a little harder to document and see, is that we are putting, or at least some of us are putting, different values on the qualities of these different choices than we were in the past. The big example of this is what's going on with the millennials. So lots of talk about how the millennials are different from us older generations. And I think we all have anecdotes about this. Probably some of you are yourselves anecdotes about this. My anecdotes are my niece Allison on the left, who is living the car-free life in San Francisco, where she commutes by bus or bike or ferry over to Sausalito, makes use of Uber and Lyft, and lives very nicely without a car. On the right is my daughter Hannah, who in Davis was, I confess this, the first of her friends to get a driver's license, even though I'm the bike person. But it was because I didn't want to have to drive her around. So I'm going to come back to the parents' issue in a few slides. It's not just about the kids. All right, so the best documented trend with millennials, I would say, is what's going on with driver's licenses. So that we're seeing that younger people are much less likely to have a driver's license now than they were back in 1995. That the rates of having driver's licenses are now much lower. And a lot of folks have looked into, used the national data and California data to dig into this a little more. We've been exploring this a bit ourselves using our own surveys where we were trying to get at some of the underlying factors that might explain this lowering of the rate of driver's licenses. So this first data comes from our campus travel survey that we do every year at UC Davis. We include students, faculty, and staff, so we get a nice cross-section in terms of age. And you can see, in this case, we're looking at the share of people in these different generations who got their driver's license within 1 year of their eligible age, so 16 or whatever that is. And you can see that, yes, there has been a drop-off in how quickly, at least, people get their driver's licenses. So millennials in our sample, only about half of them got their driver's license as soon as they could. And I can tell you, when I turned 16, my friends and I, we were down at the DMV on our birthday getting our license, and I see a few nods in the audience. Now, we asked a bunch of questions, had a lot of hypotheses about what might be explaining this, and I'm not going to show you everything. But, for example, we thought, well, maybe it has to do with kind of social norms around transportation, in high school. In high school, you're very susceptible to peers. Maybe there's something going on there. So we had an agree-disagree question on the survey about driving was the coolest way to get to school. And there were differences, but not the right pattern to explain what we were seeing with driver's licenses. And in fact, the Gen Xers were the most likely to agree that driving was the coolest way to get to school, which we might not have expected. But look at this one. Agreement with the statement, my parents were happy to drive me places. So, yeah, I can tell you my parents were not happy about driving me places. But you look at the millennials, and it's become a way of life, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced yourselves. So I think there's something going on here, not just with the millennials, but with the parents. And what happens in these teenage years could then have lasting effects as these kids get older. Here's the results of our modeling, and I won't explain this in detail, but it's age across the bottom axis here. And this is just showing kind of the inflection point where from 35 on, no real age difference in terms of who's getting their license and who isn't, or who's delaying getting their license and who isn't. But below 35, we do see this delay. So it does seem about right that I guess I should have defined that millennials, which go from about 16, 17 now up to 35 or so, it does seem like there's something different going on with them. Another survey where we looked at this was a high school survey. We surveyed kids at Davis High School as well as Tamalpais High School in Marin and Sequoia High School down in Redwood City. It was a lot focused on bicycling, but we also asked about driver's licenses. And then again, looked at a bunch of kind of attitudinal statements to see if they were associated with getting a driver's license on time. So those who can rely on their parents to drive, less likely to get their driver's license on time. So more delay in licensing. And this was another interesting thing we were very interested in. There's this hypothesis that, as kids are more involved with their smartphones, they're going to be, less interested in driving because they'd rather be able to be on their smartphone all the time. But we found that those who owned a smartphone were more likely to get their license on time. And of course, what's going on is there's an income effect in there, which we couldn't really capture in our survey of high school kids. So, starting to hint at some of these underlying societal changes that may be explaining this observed decline in the rate of licensing. To dig into this a little more and to get at aspects of transportation other than getting a driver's license, we undertook what we call our Millennials survey, although we also included Gen X age people in the survey. This effort is led by Giovanni Circella, who's a researcher at UC Davis. We surveyed people throughout California. It was a geographically stratified sample, so we have people in rural areas and urban areas all through the state. And I can get into more details of the survey if you're interested. We are in the midst of kind of cleaning up and starting to analyze this data, so I don't have a lot of definitive results, but I thought I would share with you some of the interesting nuggets that are coming out of this. So, for example, vehicle miles traveled, VMT. Hopefully all the graphs are the same, where the millennials are in blue and Gen X is in yellow. And you can see that millennials are reporting lower VMT than Gen Xers. And the urban-suburban differences maybe not as great as you might think. The intergenerational differences seem to be a little bigger than the interlocational differences. Mode split, oh, sorry about that. I don't know what happened over there, but it's the same categories over here. So drive alone, you can see for millennials, drive alone is quite a bit less than it is for Gen Xers. And the increase is spread kind of across a whole bunch of different modes rather than one mode in particular. Some other interesting tidbits, residential preferences, the longer-term choices about where you want to live, where you live now and where you want to live in the future. So we asked, again, an agree, disagree sort of question. I prefer to live close to transit, even if it means I'll have a smaller home and live in a more crowded area. That's another hypothesis about the millennials, that they're more interested in that kind of urban living. And we did find a little bit of that. So Gen X much more likely to strongly disagree than the millennials, and the millennials a little more, agreeing with that, but maybe not a huge difference as much as the talk would make you think. We should raise the price of gasoline to reduce the negative impacts on the environment. Are we seeing these differences because millennials are more environmentally oriented and environmentally concerned? And we do see a little bit of that. Well, a little more strongly agree among the millennials, a lot more disagree among Gen X, but again, not really huge differences there. And then again, this question about smartphones is something we're interested in exploring. And in this case, the question is, that I use smartphone to decide which means of transportation or combinations of multiple means to use for a trip. So higher rates of use of smartphones for organizing their transportation than among the Gen Xers were much likely to say they are not doing that. So we, seeing some evidence of smartphones coming into play. Multitasking with traveling, another aspect of smartphones. So here we are seeing differences. This is getting a little messy. Sorry, there's so much here. But millennials, so let's see, in this case, multitask while commuting is yellow. So you can see millennials, regardless of what region, they're doing that more than the Gen Xers are. So maybe there is something to this use of wanting to be able to use smartphones while you're traveling that could be leading to differences in mode choice. And then, of course, Uber, Lyft, ride-sharing services of various sorts. I confess I still have not used this. We don't have a lot of need for it in Davis. But you can see here that Gen Xers much more likely to say, I have heard of it, but I've never used it. And the millennials more likely to be using it. So we do see some shifts, both in the behavior and in some of the thinking that may underlie these differences in behavior. And we have more work to do to really sort this out, but the results so far are tantalizing. Oh, wait, I have one more. Okay, so this is really complicated, and I apologize, but let me just point out. So, of course, one thing we're trying to figure out is if the use of ride-sharing services reduces driving or has other impacts on travel. So here, this question is, did your use of ride-sharing reduce the amount of driving that you did? And it's low in both cases. In other words, it doesn't seem to be so much about reducing driving.
but it is lower for millennials than it is for Gen X. So they're using it more, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily replacing their driving. And then the one that seemed to be most different was walking and biking. So for millennials, they were more likely to say that it reduced their walking and biking. In other words, they're ride sharing instead of walking and biking, which would be a big concern to the public health people who are hoping to get people to be more physically active in their travel. All right, so again, tantalizing results, lots more to do, and we should be producing some more definitive stuff over the next year. As I said, smartphones and travel is one of the interesting questions we're exploring. You know, smartphones give us a lot more flexibility about activities and the scheduling of activities, where we go, when we go, how we meet up with people. Flexibility in travel in that we can get real-time information, like I will, as soon as we're done, check the Amtrak schedule to see if the train is late and I can actually catch it and get home to Davis a little earlier. And then productive travel time, which is of course why I took the train, was so that I could be checking my email and getting some work done on my way here. So understanding how smartphones are affecting travel, I think, is a really important thing. I am particularly interested in what's going on with bicycling and this possibility that there is a growing bicycle culture within the millennial generation. You know, it's a part of this hipster, urban, Portland-influenced lifestyle thing that may be happening, at least in some parts of the country. New York Times, you know, periodically has these articles that are really about how bicycling is a part of the young culture there. I think the culture angle on this is very important because in all the bicycle research we do up in Davis and other places shows that agreement with the statement, I like riding a bike, has a huge impact on how much people bicycle. So if you strongly agree with that statement, you're twice as likely to bicycle if you only agree. So as the culture changes, if individual preferences for bicycling change, we could see a notable shift towards bicycling. In fact, we're already seeing it in some places. Related to this, we did a really fun little study last year. Allie Thomas, who was a Berkeley grad and came up to Davis to do a postdoc last year. Joan Walker was in this study. We looked at parents in the Bay Area who have electric assist bicycles, often of this sort of a design, the cargo bike with the extended back that you can put kids on. And they're using these bikes to get their kids around. So we interviewed them to understand who they are, why they're doing it. We heard a lot about how their friends tell them they're crazy to be driving around with their kids on the bike in San Francisco, but they're very committed to doing it. And I think this is particularly interesting and potentially important because it shows that that some of this behavior change may carry over into the life stages where you're having kids. And typically we think that's when you have to give up the bus and the bike and you're buying a minivan. But maybe there are ways that can be avoided. All right, and then I should point out that we need to also look at the other end of the age spectrum, where things are also very different than they were in the past, and that older generations now are driving a lot more than previous generations were at the same age. So this is not something we've looked into much at Davis, but other people are doing work on this, and this is going to be an important part of the future of travel demand story. All right, so back to my little matrix. Lots of changes going on in each of these cells that we need to better understand if we're going to get a handle on where the future of travel demand is going. What does all this add up to for VMT, the kind of stuff I've talked about? Well, I would say we don't know yet, but it depends on how the choices stack up. Are these new transit choices, the ride-sharing choices, do they outweigh the traditional driving choice? Are they better for people than the traditional choice? Are we going to tip the balance towards these other modes? What substitutes for what is a really important question, as I've suggested. So when you use ride-sharing or one of these new transit services, is it replacing oh, when you use Lyft, is it replacing you driving your own car, or is it replacing you getting on the bus? Very different implications for VMT and thus the environment. Will some of these new services generate entirely new trips because travel has become easier and cheaper? So, I think some of the ride sharing that is happening is not substituting for anything. It's people using it's substituting for other recreational activities rather than other forms of travel. And of course, autonomous vehicles, here's the really big question. If you can sit in your car and do whatever you want, are you going to choose to do more of that than you would have before? So that we will see. Lots of smart people who've thought about where this is all going have concluded that we really can't say yet. This quote's a couple years ago, but I don't know that we're any farther towards really understanding the changes in the transportation landscape and their implications for how much we are driving. But it is important to point out, of course, that it is partly within our control. It isn't just happening to us, but in fact, through our policies and programs, we can shape the future of travel demand. So I want to come back to this and just say a little bit about, we have control over the sets of choices available, whether it's publicly provided choices or it's the regulation of privately provided choices. And we can influence the quality of the choices available. As I said, I first put this talk together last summer, and it had followed a really kind of startling week where in Portland, they opened a bridge that is for everybody but cars. So bikes, peds, skateboards, transit, everything but cars. So making those choices better, and in a lot of cases better than driving would be. That was right around the time that San Francisco closed Market Street to private vehicles. A big change, maybe not so surprising for San Francisco. And then also LA came out with their plan to take space for cars on all of those big arterial streets and turn some of it over to bikes and transit in a much bigger way than they'd ever talked about before. So, we are seeing this shift towards providing other choices and making those choices more competitive with driving. And all of this, I think, is going to start to have an impact. If we do enough, we'll start tipping the balance towards these other choices. Now, there is a converse side to this I'm just going to mention, which is, of course, the other thing that would tip us towards those other choices is if driving becomes bad enough, right? I mean, the congestion that we experience in regions like this is really a good incentive for thinking about getting on BART or Amtrak or riding your bike. So I think there's some natural push towards these other modes that's happening just because we can't alleviate the congestion problem. So it's kind of the carrot and the stick approach. We can make the alternatives better, but if we make driving worse, that's also going to push people in the other direction. Now, talking about making driving worse is kind of a challenging thing to do in the US, and it sounds kind of un-American. There's a lot of resistance to restricting driving in any sort of way, whether it's pricing or physical restrictions. Other parts of the world have had good success with this, like the London congestion pricing scheme. Lots of European cities, and I think that's actually Montreal, have closed parts of the city to car traffic, and it's been very successful. We have a hard time doing that kind of thing in this country. I will point out that not all driving is necessarily that important. So I think it is possible to talk about driving that is valuable and driving that is less clearly valuable, and can we find strategies that would get people out of their cars for those trips where there really isn't so much value to the driving. And of course, I got to throw in here that we're not trying to, it's not about trying to get everybody driving. Really, the goal is accessibility anyway, right? Giving people access to the activities, the services, the goods that they need. So if we think about things in a different way, it leads to different kinds of solutions and strategies. I think we are seeing a slow but steady shift in the transportation planning and policy world away from the traditional approach, which was focused on making it easier to drive, which meant being focused on level of service, intersection level of service, freeway level of service, that was really all about planning for making it easier to get around, planning for mobility. The new way is to focus on making it easier not to drive, to focus on livability, to focus on accessibility. And you see movement in a lot of parts of the country, certainly in this region and other parts of California, towards this different way of thinking about the transportation system. And that could have a big impact on the future of travel demand. So just to wrap up, we talk a lot at Davis about transforming the transportation system to be more sustainable and the challenges associated with that. I don't know if my colleagues would agree, but I would say, you know, the work on alternative fuel vehicles has been hard, but we've made a lot of really good success. The work on the fuels themselves, maybe a little bit harder, but there again, we're making some progress. But I think most of my colleagues would agree that this demand part of it is the hardest of all, getting people to do something different, to get them to change the choices that they make. So we talk about that as the wobbly third leg of the stool. And then I will just end by noting that, of course, what I've been talking about is passenger transportation only, and that is hard enough. We've got the same sets of issues around freight transportation, so we've got a lot of new work going on around sustainable freight. Again, having to do both with the vehicles and the fuels, but also the demand side of things. And then there's the long-distance air travel, which I think is going to be the hardest of all. And some of us are just starting to dig into that a little bit. I can't tell you how many miles I've flown around the world to talk about reducing driving. So with that, I will wrap up. And thank you again for having me, and look forward to your questions.
So we have time for questions.
I see one right there.
Thank you. I noticed when you're talking about the choices people make, you listed, I think, 4 qualities: safety, comfort, etc. But the one that was missing was concern about the environment, which is a big reason I know that a lot of people I know are willing to put up with a little, discomfort and lack of convenience in order to make a different choice. And so I'm wondering why that's not one of the factors that you're considering.
It absolutely is one of the factors. So that was just a little illustration, not terribly well thought through. But
what's interesting is that my millennial friends tend to be more likely to choose the more convenient form of transportation than my older friends. So that kind of goes against your data there.
Yeah, but maybe because they're not so worried about the environment. Yeah, so in most of the surveys we do ask about environmental attitudes, concern for the environment. And I would say it is generally a significant predictor of what people are doing, but not the most important one. And so sometimes, people say they're, on a survey you ask, are you concerned about the environment? Almost everybody says they are, so we're probably not doing a very good job of measuring kind of really how deep that concern goes. So I think there is something there, but for most folks, the more practical issues tend to override that, except for the most committed. Yeah, well, the whole social norms thing. Can you shame people into doing the right thing? Shame people into not doing the... Yeah, we were really interested in kind of the whole peer pressure thing in high school, which I think works the other way, that biking is seen as we've had people say this, it was dorky, it was the nerdy thing to do. And how do you flip that around so it becomes the cool thing to do? I think that's a really important part of all this.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Very interesting work. I actually have two questions. One is very brief. How do you recruit participants for your survey, and what do you consider a large enough sample? And then the second question is, one of your survey questions asked whether people would accept, a smaller home for the benefit of being close to transit. But there are many other compelling reasons why people and young people want to live in an urban center, and are some of those reasons maybe more important than the transit benefit?
Right, yeah. So your first question about surveys, how do we recruit and what's a big enough sample and all that? So each survey is a little different. The Millennials survey that we did statewide, we used a panel, a panel that we accessed through a commercial vendor to do an online survey. So there are definitely issues about how representative the sample they drew from is. Like I said, we geographically stratified it, and then we've done a lot of looking at our demographic characteristics in the survey versus the state, demographic characteristics, and we think it's not too bad. But again, there could be attitudinal differences in our sample that aren't representative of the population as a whole. I think the numbers up there were on the order of 1,600, 2,000 in the sample, which is a very good number. More important than the number is how representative that sample is. So you could have an even smaller sample as long as it really represented the population you're looking at. And that's what's really hard to get. The high school survey, we did it at the high school, so we had like a 75% response rate. 75% of the kids completed the survey. So that's pretty darn good. So anyway, it just varies for each survey. And then other reasons to be interested in that sort of urban living. So I'd have to look at the survey again to see if we asked some other aspects of that. But certainly in answering that question, we might have gotten people agreeing with that, even if transit wasn't a big part of why they valued that sort of environment. I'd have to take a look again, though. But I think you're exactly right. There are a lot of other reasons they like those environments other than transit. And maybe transit's becoming less important as we've got Uber and Lyft to kind of fill in.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi. You mentioned that the congestion on roadways may push people to make alternative choices. I wonder, on the policy level, we now see the trend of implementing express lanes. How is there a relationship, and what do you see happening there with the express lane implementation?
So, where to start? Okay, so I do not believe we can build our way out of congestion, right? I mean, we've been expanding the highway system for decades, and we never really get ahead of it. And as congestion increases, as I said, that's going to push people to other sorts of choices. So how do express lanes fit in? Well, it is adding to the capacity of the highway system, but doing it in a very special way. And I guess the way I see it is that is providing an alternative to being stuck in traffic when you need that alternative. And to me, that's how we address congestion. It's not that we lower congestion levels, but that we provide alternatives to being stuck in traffic. So I'm a little personally ambivalent about adding those express lanes because it is more highway capacity and it's kind of working against other policies. In California, we are trying to reduce vehicle miles of travel. So it is to some extent working against that. But it is a really important option for the people who need it when they need it, that they can bypass that congestion. So there's some good societal good to that. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay. Yeah. So if we're going to expand the highway system, I like the fact that we're doing it that way rather than just.
The challenge is that in some cases the express lanes are not really handling capacity. They're taking away one lane that would be a shared lane, making that as express lanes.
Well, yeah, then there is all of that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The money they can drive on express lane, but not everybody can afford that.
No, not everybody can afford that, but that's true of a lot of things. And it is there if, if they really need it. They may not be able to afford to use it every day, but on those emergency days, at least that option is there. Whereas if you didn't have it, there's no alternative. You're stuck in traffic, right? So yeah, I think they're good arguments on both sides. Like I said, I'm kind of ambivalent about that approach.
So one contributing factor might be with the decrease in driver's license for the youth is basically they don't teach driver's ed in high school anymore.
Uh-huh. Yes.
So that was a class that you took, and it was a natural process.
Right.
And now you have to get an outside source, and that probably had a big effect in diminishing the.
I think it's a contributing factor, not the only thing. People have looked at graduated driver's licensing. Most states now have a system where, for a year you've got a provisional license, so you can't drive your friends around, which makes it. When I got my license, then that night I'm driving my friends around everywhere, right? So it makes it less, it's less of a big deal to get your license now because you've got that whole year to wait before you're really driving on your own. But this is all anecdotal. I agree with you about the way that people are doing the training. I mean, what I hear from my daughters and their friends is they hate that online course that they're taking for driver's ed. Until they'll get started, and then they get bored and stuck, and they just never get it done. But that said, if they were really motivated, if they really wanted their license, they would do it, right? So I think it's a part of the mix, but not necessarily the big factor.
I think we could do one more very quick question.
Hi.
Hi.
I just moved over here from Germany, where we use our bicycles a lot and a lot. And I planned on bringing my bike with me, which I ended up doing. But all my friends who had been to the US before, they said, don't bother. You can't use your bike. The cities are so stretched out. They have highways in the cities. You can't get across bridges. Leave it. And I did bring it, and I'm very happy I did, because in San Francisco it's good to ride a bike, and it works well. I mean, it stops by the Oakland Bay Bridge. You can't get across. But what do you think is possible for a typical American city? Is it possible to change it into a bike environment? And who needs to start that change? Is it coming from the community? Is it coming from the government or the companies even? Because the Oakland Bay Bridge, for example, why is it not being processed further?
Well, I live in Davis, which is bicycle mecca for the U.S. You need to come visit with your bike. You can take it on the train and do a nice tour. So I tend to be I have a rosy view of all this. But I do think it's possible in lots of parts of the U.S. for biking to be a more widely used daily mode of transportation. We have a huge share of our trips are under 2 miles. Which is relatively easy biking distance, depending on topography. It is happening in U.S. cities. I mean, San Francisco has made a huge investment in their bicycle infrastructure in the past 5 or 6 years, and have seen really measurable increases in bicycling. Places like Portland have done it, New York has done it, Washington, D.C. So it is happening. It's a lot coming from local advocacy groups who are pushing investments in bicycling. But the cities seem to themselves have really bought into this, the local governments. And I think it does kind of go along with that whole, that urban, we want young, bright people who are going to make our economy go, living in our city, and a part of that is to make sure that biking is a viable mode of transportation. So I think it is happening, slowly but surely, at least in some places. And there's some, kind of odd parts, some I shouldn't say odd, unexpected parts of the U.S. where you're seeing investments in bicycling, like I think it's Chattanooga, Tennessee has done quite a bit. The public health community is really pushing active travel. That's a lot focused on walking, but that's helped the bicycling cause as well. So we're inching in that direction. And you can use federal funding to invest in bicycle infrastructure.
Thanks, Susan, for a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.